Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday, May 22nd, 2025. Today is day 594. This is the regular weekly Thursday update. I'm sorry I wasn't able to do this live with you. I was grateful Destiny did it for those of you who joined us online. Since I'm on the West Coast, the time difference just didn't quite work, but I wanted to give an update of the major news that's happened in the Middle East over the last week. I am only 4 days out. On Sunday, I'm doing the half Ironman, raising money for Gaza to end the atrocities there as we're working for a comprehensive permanent ceasefire, working to end the occupation, working for a lasting peace settlement between Palestinians and Israelis, an end to all conflicts in the Middle East. So if you'd like to follow that, you can find that on my website at maycannon.com or on CMEP social media. But I would covet your prayers because it's a half Ironman, and with my health issues, I'm about a month to 2 months behind in terms of training. And so we say peace is possible, and I believe that. And it feels like a half Ironman and the full Ironman in September feels quite impossible. But news from the Middle East. Last night, there was breaking news at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. Two embassy staff members from the Israeli embassy were shot and killed. This was outside of a Jewish museum in Washington, D.C. The two victims were a couple that were about to be engaged. Four people were shot with a handgun outside of the Jewish museum. A single suspect was identified. He was from Chicago. This happened at the Capitol Jewish Museum. This was on Wednesday night. There is a suspect in custody. This happened, I found this out in the news when I was going to bed, maybe midnight on the West Coast time, so early morning hours. So it happened Wednesday night in DC, only about a mile, 1.3 miles from the White House in Northwest DC. Um, it is said that the single suspect chanted free Palestine, after being taken into custody. After the shooting, the suspect entered the museum and was detained by event security, once in handcuffs. The suspect identified where he discarded the weapon. The weapon was recovered, and he implied that he committed the offense. Israel's ambassador to the United States later told reporters that the young man killed had just purchased a ring this week with the intention of proposing to his girlfriend next week in Jerusalem. Just another tragedy in the ongoing atrocities that continue to be committed. In Gaza, Netanyahu moved forward with the plan this week to massively escalate the fighting to fully reoccupy Gaza, increasing and launching an extensive air and ground offensive over the weekend aimed to push Hamas to demilitarize and to release remaining hostages. Israeli strikes killed more than 300 people and injured 1,000 more over the weekend since Thursday. This closed the last functioning hospital in North Gaza. The UN Secretary General Guterres said on Saturday that the situation in the territory was beyond inhumane. A May 12th report backed by the United Nations integrated food security phase classification found that Gaza is at critical risk for famine. 93% of the population faces crisis of different levels of food insecurity. The IPC wrote, with the expansion of Israel's military operations, that the risk of famine is not just possible, it's increasingly likely. The health authorities in Gaza said that Israeli attacks killed at least 55 people on Tuesday and over 500 people in an 8-day period leading up to that. On Monday, Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered the immediate renewal of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. This was a big announcement. Thus far, it has been mostly talk. This was following 2.5 months of no food or humanitarian assistance being allowed into the Gaza Strip, and it happened as the Israeli military was increasing their strikes. According to Israeli news, it was a temporary measure that would just be a stopgap until the U.S. humanitarian aid distribution plan would go into effect at the end of May. It was a highly unpopular decision in right-wing Israeli circles. Netanyahu made this decision earlier in the week, and the order was for the resumption of, quote, basic humanitarian aid amid mounting pressure from the United States to end the blockade, again, that lasted for 2.5 months. On Monday, 5 trucks containing humanitarian assistance entered into Gaza via the Kerem Shalom. Reports that I received from the United Nations said that none of them were actually distributed. 9 trucks were approved on Monday, 5 allowed in. 5 trucks on Monday. Netanyahu's promise was what provoked that. On Tuesday, as of Tuesday, this was Tuesday afternoon, no aid had yet been distributed into Gaza despite 93 trucks entering into Gaza. So listen to this update. As of Tuesday, no aid has been distributed in Gaza to date, despite aid lorries starting to cross after 11 weeks of a blockade. A UN spokesperson said this yesterday, adding that Israel had not allowed the UN teams to access supplies. 93 trucks entered yesterday, so that was Monday, while the UN said it confirmed the entry of only a few dozen trucks. Israeli airstrikes killed 55 Palestinians on Tuesday and 15 people after that since midnight, between midnight and Wednesday morning. 91 Gazans were killed in Israeli strikes on Monday. The deaths recorded since the early hours of Monday, according to local officials. On Monday, the first 5 aid trucks entered into Gaza, as I mentioned. By Tuesday evening, no aid had yet been received by communities. The United Nations announced that they feared that 14,000 babies could be vulnerable to death if aid did not reach them quickly. Overnight into Tuesday, Israeli strikes killed at least 60 people into Gaza and hit a family home that was turned into a shelter, adding that strikes killed 38 people into Gaza. 38 people were killed in just 30 minutes in Gaza overnight into Tuesday. On Tuesday, it was announced that Israel would take over all areas of Gaza and would allow minimal aid into the territory after Israel's backers in the U.S. Senate said that extreme hunger in Gaza would affect their continued support of Tel Aviv. So Netanyahu seemed to indicate that part of the reason for aid was continuing the support of U.S. officials in Washington. Also on Tuesday, the UN did get clearance for roughly 100 aid trucks to enter into Gaza. And so we started to see these trickles going in, the 93 aid trucks that were allowed. But then we saw that trucks were allowed into Gaza, but then were stuck on the Gaza side of the border. Finally, by Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, COGAT, the Defense Ministry's coordinator for the government activities in the territories, the Israeli group, announced that 93 trucks had entered into Gaza and that they were intended for flowers for bakeries, food for babies, medical equipment, and pharmaceutical drugs. The aid underwent an inspection first by Israeli authorities before entering into Gaza. I have not received abundant reports indicating how much aid has actually gotten into bakeries. We've not seen reports of food actually being distributed since all of this happened earlier in the week. Now, Israeli strikes earlier in the week indicated that the Hamas leader, de facto leader, Mohammed Sinwar, was most likely killed. He had been injured in an airstrike, was then in a hospital. That hospital was then struck, and it's believed that he was killed. Hamas did say that they launched their it was found that they launched their October 7th attacks on Israel in order to derail negotiations intended to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. This was according to minutes of a high-level meeting the Israeli military claimed to have discovered in a tunnel in Gaza. There were no comments from Hamas. In the Cannes Music Festival, there was a mourning of the death of a Palestinian photojournalist who was killed in a Gaza airstrike this past week. Her name, Fatima Hassouna. Fatima Hassouna was killed Thursday evening a week ago. And people crammed into theaters in Cannes to watch the documentary about her life in Gaza. She used to say that this would pass. One of the directors who worked alongside of her documentary. The documentary is called Put Your Soul on Your Hand and Walk. It was shown in a French Riviera resort town. It was not a part of the official film festival. It was a different festival. And so her life and ministry was documented in that. Fatima, a photojournalist, was documenting the 18-plus months war on Gaza, and she said this of her life: "If I die, I want a loud death. I don't want to just be breaking news or a number in a group. I want a death that the world will hear." an impact that will remain through time, a timeless image that cannot be buried by time or place. On Wednesday of last week, just days before her own wedding, 25-year-old Hasuna was killed in an Israeli airstrike that hit her home in North Gaza. 10 members of her family, including her pregnant sister, were also killed. The Israeli military said that they were targeting a Hamas member that was involved in attacks on Israeli soldiers and civilians. In the occupied West Bank this past week, on Wednesday, the Israeli army fired warning shots on European, French, and other diplomats visiting the West Bank. This was a delegation of regional European and Western diplomats that were visiting the West Bank, city of Jenin and the occupied territories. This sparked condemnations from the Palestinian Authority and several European capitals. The IDF said that troops fired warning shots because the delegation deviated from the pre-approved route. No one was injured. Regarding the occupied West Bank, the Institute of Palestinian Studies posted a social media report on where is the Palestinian Authority after 100 days into the assault on Jenin, where 18,000 people have been displaced, scattered across 86 different locations, no aid plan in sight. How is the Palestinian Authority responding, they asked, and where is the urgency for them to protect their people? Over last weekend in the occupied West Bank, the IDF killed 2 Palestinians, including a teenager, in separate West Bank incidents. When the teenager was killed, it was on Saturday evening, and Israeli forces opened fire at teenagers who were throwing stones at vehicles owned by settlers in Bekaa, near Nablus. Local teenager Nadal al-Shagnupi was killed. 2 other teenagers were wounded. The other incident was a 36-year-old who was killed in Burkine near the Ariel settlement. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, IDF soldiers shot, wounded, and arrested him before he died. In terms of Israeli and Palestinian ceasefire negotiations, the report is that Hamas did agree to release half of the hostages in order for a 2-month ceasefire agreement, but there was no response, according to Israel. There's been a lot of pressure from Steve Witkoff, the U.S. negotiator in that case, the special envoy for the United States. The Trump administration's been pressuring Hamas to come to a ceasefire agreement. This happened last weekend. There's been no news of it since. There seem to be different negotiations taking place, some in Qatar, which seem to be making no progress. This was reported, and then there was nothing else heard of it since last weekend. The Qatar talks have said to come to a dead end. There are no preconditions set before the start of the negotiations. Netanyahu's said that he will not discuss any offer to stop the ongoing military operation in Gaza. In other words, there's no intention for the attacks in Gaza to be brought to an end. The excuse being given is till Hamas is completely eradicated. Europe's response, I mentioned already, the firing at the delegation in Jenin, but earlier this week, the EU determined that they're going to review their trade agreement with Israel. That pact is being reviewed because of the war escalation on Gaza. No longer business as usual. According to the EU ministers are responding. They're saying it's because of the catastrophic situation in Gaza. The situation cannot continue. The aid that Israel has allowed in is welcomed, but it is a drop in the ocean. Aid must flow immediately without obstruction and at a scale much greater, to meet the needs. The UK on Tuesday paused trade negotiations with Israel. They also summoned the Israeli ambassador to the UK and imposed new sanctions on West Bank settlers, as the EU announced that it also would review its relationship with Israel in response to the blockade of humanitarian aid. The British Prime Minister called the humanitarian situation in Gaza intolerable, just as the EU Vice President described it as catastrophic. On Monday, in a joint statement, the leaders of the UK, France, and Canada threatened further concrete actions in response if Israel does not cease the renewed military offensive and lift its restrictions on humanitarian aid entering into Gaza. These 3 countries strongly oppose the expansion of the military operations and have found the aid that has been allowed in thus far woefully inadequate. I would again call your attention June 17th to 19th. There will be a peace summit at the United Nations hosted jointly by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. French President Macron said this week, we firmly oppose the expansion of military operations in Gaza. Two-state solution must be implemented. Other Arab states have responded. There was an agreement this week between the UAE and Israel that is set to meet the needs of 15,000 civilians in Gaza by allowing additional food into the Strip. And Jordan returned 17 Palestinian children and their caregivers who were released from the territory because of medical needs. The question has been asked whether or not their return to the war zone might also be a possible violation of international law. In Iran, according to new intelligence obtained by the U.S., there is the question of whether or not Israel is preparing a possible strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. Of course, this would be a drastic escalation of the instability of the Middle East. So that's a huge question that's been discussed in the news this week. And Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has called the U.S. demand that Tehran stop enriching its uranium excessive and outrageous. He doubted whether or not the nuclear talks between the U.S. and Iran will lead to results. This response is also coming after President Trump's recent trip to the Middle East, where he visited Saudi Arabia and two other nations. And the U.S. has given a clear red line to Tehran, calling them to give up all enrichment of nuclear fuel if any deal on Iran's nuclear program is to progress. That was said by Steve Witkoff this past week. On Yemen, the Houthis launched an additional missile this past week towards Israel. The IDF said that it was intercepted, but rocket sirens blared across central Israel this week. And Houthi rebels announced what they called a maritime blockade against the Haifa port in Israel, stating that there will be retribution because of the escalations in Gaza. In Syria, the EU foreign ministers yesterday agreed to, this was not yesterday, this was earlier in the week, but they agreed to lift remaining economic sanctions on Syria. This was really following the US's lead. President Trump lifted all sanctions on Syria, giving the country an opportunity to be fully integrated into the Arab world and the economic trade agreements there. And the U.S. Did that, concluding that Syria was in imminent danger of descending back into potential collapse and a full-scale civil war of epic proportions. That was a direct quote from our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. He said that to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee this week. The World Bank announced that the debt on Syria, $15.5 million, was paid by Saudi Arabia and Qatar that will allow the World Bank to re-engage with Damascus. And Israeli and Syrian officials recently held very rare direct talks. So that's the update on Syria. A few updates in the U.S. Vice President Vance was supposed to go to Israel. He did not. He canceled that trip. It was said that he didn't want to de facto endorse the escalations in Gaza. Other news sources said that he didn't want to go, that there was a thought that there would be a peace agreement announced and that he wanted to be there for the announcement and that the peace agreement fell through. So we just know that the trip was canceled. President Trump has been frustrated by Israel's ongoing offensive in Gaza and has instructed his aides to tell Prime Minister Netanyahu to wrap up the conflict, was reported. The Pentagon also this week took possession of the Qatari luxury jet that was sought by the Trump administration for its use as Air Force One. This plane, a $400 million plane, it said that it would take a couple of years for it to meet the security requirements to be used as Air Force One, but that happened this week. There are grave questions by several members of Congress about whether or not the deal is ethical. Not unlike the Iron Dome system, Trump yesterday announced a $175 billion three-year plan to build a new Golden Dome missile defense system capable of intercepting missiles launched from the other side of the world. So that was announced this week. And some of the biggest news related to the Middle East has to do with the story that was leaked about how the Trump administration is in conversation about moving 1 million Palestinians from Gaza to Libya. That broke earlier in the week. Libyan leadership, apparently, if that happened, the administration would release to Libya billions of dollars of funds that the U.S. has frozen more than a decade ago. No final agreement was reached. That was broken 7 or 10 days ago. Of course, the idea of the displacement of Palestinians has been gravely criticized by Arab states and many, many others. The U.S. Embassy in Libya denied the report that this was the case, and Libya denied it as well, but that was big news. Churches for Middle East Peace did put out a statement this week and stood alongside numerous Israeli human rights organizations demanding a ceasefire and the entry of aid. This came out right after the announcement that aid would resume. The groups included a number of Israeli human rights organizations that we work with. This is not a comprehensive list, but it includes Bet Salem, Breaking the Silence, Combatants for Peace, Gisha, Hamoked, Uramim, Rabbis for Human Rights, the Parents Circle, Yesh Din, and many, many others. They said that Netanyahu's statement to allow basic aid into the territory demonstrates that Israel has no intention to stop its unlawful use of aid as a lever for political pressure. I would encourage you to read that statement. We're calling again for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. We're calling for the immediate stop of attacks, to stop the policy of starvation, to open the crossings for the entry of aid to Gaza, and to allow aid organizations in the Strip to carry out their work. I would invite you to consider joining us at Church at the Crossroads in Glen Ellen, Illinois in September. You can find more about that at Churches for Middle East Peace's website. And just to close with a word of prayer from Sabeel. This is from their Wave of Prayer. Divine Creator, we are in despair for the deaths of our people and for the fact that attacks on hospitals and civilians have become a normal reality. In the darkest of times, we put our faith in you, who is the bearer of light and all goodness. Do not forsake us, Lord, but be present with all who suffer. Open the hearts of everyone in conflict, especially the leaders of this world, that they may repent and work towards peace and justice. Continue to embolden us to put to end this evil and to work towards a world where every human can live in dignity. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. In the name of Christ, amen.